All righty, it's 1 o'clock on June 20th, the summer solstice. Good having everyone together on the longest, possibly hottest day of the year. I'm Mark Stewart, Climate Change Program Manager at MDE. Note that this meeting is being recorded, so do be mindful of your cameras and microphones. It's great having so many people joining us today. More people are joining right now. Are there any MWG members who are joining by phone, or is there anyone who's standing in for an MWG member today? Yeah.
Yeah, Elliot Campbell, SI joined this meeting representing DNR. I also see Secretary Kurtz is on also. So make you aware of that. Thank you.
Great seeing you. Good seeing you. Although the Josh Kurtz on the line might be the other Josh Kurtz in Maryland and not the secretary. I'm not sure. Great, and I see Mari is with us. I think Mari, thanks for the heads up. You're standing in, I think, for Michelle Dietz today. Is that right?
That's correct. Thank you. Sorry for coming in and out. I was having problems with my audio. Thank you.
Yep, no worries. Great. And to all the members of the public who are participating in today's meeting, thank you for being here. We'll leave time later in today's meeting for public comments and to give everyone here the opportunity to participate in the discussion. And thanks, other Josh Kurtz, for joining us today. Turning it over to the co-chairs, Michael Powell and Kim Coble, for opening remarks.
Kim, you want me to start?
Sure.
We're dedicating today to talk about various funding options. The climate plan calls for a significant amount of money to be dedicated to various issues. The state, as many of you know, is facing a significant structural deficit as well. So I think the funding issue is complicated and difficult. And so we've asked a number of experts to present some of the various options that are being discussed, as well as asking the Chamber of Commerce to provide their view on the issues for what it's worth. These are very difficult and complex issues. So please think about them carefully, because we are coming up on the date for us to make our recommendations. Kim?
Yeah, thanks. And I'm going to go off camera shortly because my internet seems to be spacey. But first of all, thank you all for being here and joining it. As Mike said, it's a really critical topic. It's one that has to be solved, though, right? We have to find a way through this. Fortunately, we're not the only state that's struggling with this. There's good models out there. There's definitely trials that have been done and succeeded in other states. So I think we can learn a lot from what else is happening out there. But I think we're going to just have to stay really committed to finding solutions. They won't be perfect, but as long as we're making progress, I'd say that's the goals being met. So look forward to today's conversation.
Great, thank you, Kim and Mike, and I'm happy to help facilitate today's conversation. First, just a couple of updates from MDE. On June 4th, Governor Moore issued an executive order called Leadership by State Government Implementing Maryland's Climate Pollution Reduction Plan. I'll provide a link to the executive order in the chat so that all of you can access it. This executive order has, it's multi-pronged. It has several core components, including requiring each agency to develop a climate implementation plan and to submit that climate implementation plan to the governor by November 1 of this year. The climate implementation plan is meant to be the agency's specific plan to implement Maryland's climate pollution reduction plan, which of course MDE published in December of 2023. It also creates a governor's sub-cabinet on climate, which will increase agency coordination on climate change activities and especially pursuing federal funds for climate initiatives. And then it calls on several agencies to take specific next steps that were largely called on in the climate pollution reduction plan, including, for instance, calling on MDE to propose clean heat standards and zero emission heating equipment standards. I also just want to note as we get into today's meeting that the MWG meetings are being recorded, and the recordings are posted on the MWG's website. And in fact, Susan, if you could put a link to the MWG's website, thank you very much, so that everyone has it. You can find past meeting recordings there. All right, so I'd like to set the stage for today's discussion on climate funding policies. As many of you know, state law requires Maryland to reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions 60% from 2006 levels by 2031. This is the most ambitious near-term emissions reduction target of any U.S. state. Maryland's climate pollution reduction plan informs us that fully implementing current policies will reduce emissions approximately 51% by 2031. Current policies include Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks, Building Energy Performance Standards, the Empower Maryland program, renewable portfolio standards, so on and so forth. It also includes all of the federal investments. So we do all of that. We fully implement all the on the books things. We get to maybe a 51% reduction by 2031. Adding new sectoral policies called on in the plan could reduce emissions by approximately 56% by 2031. New sectoral policies include Advanced Clean Fleets, Clean Power Standard, which is implementing Governor Moore's goal of achieving 100% clean power by 2035, zero emission heating equipment standards, and so on. All of the new policies that are called on in the climate plan. And the plan further says that additional policies, such as an economy-wide cap and invest program, could be necessary for Maryland to achieve its emission reduction goals in 2031 and 2045. The climate plan calls on MDE to evaluate a cap and invest program this year. MDE is happy to have the support from the brilliant folks at Resources for the Future, which is funded by the U.S. Climate Alliance to support the states on carbon pricing policies like cap and invest. And we'll hear from some of those great folks from RFF today. However, as the climate plan points out, cap and invest is not the only option. Chapter 5 of the plan provides a few options for the state to consider. To achieve the state's emissions reduction goals, additional policies would need to reduce emissions by 3.5 million metric tons in 2031 and by more than 15 million tons in 2045. The climate plan also proposes that revenue from a new funding policy would provide home electrification incentives covering up to 100% of costs for low and moderate income households and 50% of costs for middle income households to electrify, providing additional EV incentives, making EVs the lowest cost vehicles to purchase and own for everyone, commercial building incentives, reducing the cost of energy efficiency and electrification projects in commercial, multifamily, institutional, and other building types, infrastructure investments, supporting projects that reduce GHG emissions from Maryland's industrial and waste sectors, and building out critical infrastructure, including EV charging stations. Natural and working land investments, supporting tree plantings, forest management, wetland management, soil management, and other projects that are critical for storing carbon and helping the state achieve its net zero emissions goal by 2045. And also investing in workforce development. For these details and more, please read Maryland's Climate Pollution Reduction Plan. The MWG co-chairs have called on the MWG to take on the unenviable task of recommending a climate funding policy for the state this year. The MWG will have between now and early September to develop that recommendation. To help the MWG do that, the co-chairs have invited several guest speakers to discuss the major climate funding policies that were considered during this year's legislative session. For that, we've assembled the following panel. I'll mention all of the panelists and then I'll call on them in order. We will spend basically the first half of today's meeting in presentation mode, hearing high-level overview of each of these core policies that are under consideration. And then we'll spend the second half of the meeting in really open discussion so that we can engage with the panelists and think more about the policy implications here in Maryland. So today we're joined by Dallas Bertrall, Senior Fellow at Resources for the Future. He's joined by his colleagues Kevin Rennert, Fellow and Director of the Federal Climate Policy Initiative, and Mark Halfstead, Fellow and Director of the Carbon Pricing Initiative at Resources for the Future. And they'll be the first up to give presentations. But before I turn it to them, let me just share the rest of the lineup for the presentations. We're joined also by Wandra Ashley Williams, Maryland Regional Director at Climate Exchange, Delegate Dana Stein, and Delegate and Speaker Pro Tem of the Maryland House of Delegates, and Jamie DeMarco, Maryland Director at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to facilitate today's panel and discussion. Should be an action-packed meeting. With that, I'm going to turn things over, I think, first to Dallas.
One clarification, Mark. I think we said we wanted people to, unless there's some clarification needed, to hold questions until the end of all the panelists, because otherwise we were afraid we wouldn't get through every panel.
That's right. Thank you for the reminder, Mike. Dallas, would you like to take it away? And thank you for being here. You know what, Dallas? I see that you unmuted, but we don't hear you. So it might be an issue of selecting the right microphone on the little microphone doohickey carrot thing next to the mic. Not yet. Yeah. If you see the little mic, there's a little carrot. I think is that called a carrot? I don't know. I'm not the IT guy. And that should allow you to select a different microphone. No.
How about now?
Hey, there it is. We got you.
Thank you. Well, I was going to start by saying thank you very much for having us. Mark, Kevin, and I are really appreciative of the work you're doing and the opportunity to work with you. And now I have to apologize for the slow start. So now let me see if I can share my screen and we'll get going. Is it working? Yes, I think so.
Yep, we're good.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, thanks, y'all. We have just issued a report that I think was shared with you coming into today's meeting on regulatory options for an enforceable cap and invest program in Maryland. Whoops. Just by way of background, Resources for the Future is a 72-year-old organization that specializes in environmental and natural resource economics and policy. And we are a non-advocacy organization and do not take stands on specific legislative matters. Okay, now this, Mark already gave us this background, but just as a way of jumping into the pool, I want to point out the trends that are happening in the background are, good news, but they are insufficient even with the policy framework that Mark described to achieve Maryland's goals. Since 2006, most of the emission reductions have been achieved in the power sector. There's been modest reductions in industry, waste, buildings, and transportation. And we have to be a little bit guarded about the reductions in transportation because we have the benefit, well, such as it is, that we observe the benefit of reduced vehicle miles traveled during 2020 due to the pandemic. So we'll be very lucky if there's not a bounce back in that category. So the proposed policies for Maryland's climate pathway report include expanding the RPS, strengthening RGGI to achieve zero regional greenhouse gas emissions, a number of other ones that you've seen, I've heard enumerated, and you've talked about before. And so we're focusing in now on this one at the bottom of the list, economy-wide cap and invest. And in particular, I want to think a little bit about how it relates to the other policies and helps strengthen the overall portfolio that Maryland is putting together. So what is cap and invest? It really boils down to these three simple pillars. It sets an emissions cap. So covered entities surrender 1 allowance per ton. That emissions cap, it can be declining over time. That's an important decision that we'll come back to. Uses auctions to distribute allowances, or could distribute allowances for free with some justification. We'll come back to that. And invests auction proceeds to generate emission reductions and to achieve fairness goals. So the important idea is that I want to transmit is that a well-designed cap and invest program amplifies and accelerates the impacts of regulations. They are not opposed. For a long time, for a couple of decades, I think most policy analysts characterize them as one or the other. But the conversation has moved way beyond that. And now we're trying to understand how they can be designed to amplify each other and complement each other. The cap in this context, well, that is recognizing that in jurisdictions across the world and everywhere where there's carbon pricing, roughly speaking, it's fair to say that 80% of the emission reductions that have been achieved have been due to direct regulations, direct policy. And yet we see that that has not been sufficient in those jurisdictions to achieve climate goals. And so nothing that we're going to say is going to suggest that cap and invest is going to crowd out those regulatory initiatives, but rather it's going to strengthen those regulatory initiatives. And this can happen by improving cost effectiveness. Regulators cannot see all the options that exist the way private actors can. So cap and invest creates an incentive for individual actions and catches all the low-hanging fruit. I like to say it, it's the leave no low-cost emission reduction policy as part of the overall policy suite. It provides polluter pay incentives to reduce emissions over time. That is, gives private parties the incentive looking forward, recognizing the carbon price that an emissions ton avoided is $1 earned for them. And so they have this incentive themselves to try to seek ways to reduce emissions, even beyond those specified by regulation. It generates revenues for investments and fairness, and it increases predictability of regulations because and many times regulations have outperformed and they achieve emission reductions in a really encouraging way. And many times regulation hasn't achieved its goals. It can go both ways. To point to one, policies generally in the states have not achieved their vehicle miles traveled goals. So there is an uncertainty as to how well and when regulations are going to achieve their goals. And the Cap and Invest program complements that by setting a specific emissions target, and then it itself, the market, adjusts to the uncertainty that's inherent in regulatory approaches through changes in the price, potentially changes in the number of emission allowances that are introduced also. And then, most importantly, I think from an environmental advocacy standpoint, sometimes in the past, people have pointed to cap and trade programs as being sort of getting in the way because emissions cap is an emissions floor, and it sort of steals the incentive for doing additional measures by institutions and civil society and local government or what have you. But we want to talk about designing a cap and invest program that prevents backsliding and accelerates the kind of contributions that are being made by the other actors that are part of our social efforts. Okay, so cap and invest is important to achieve fairness, and this picture is meant to explain why we think that's the case. So this represents, it's drawn from data for Maryland from the Consumer Expenditure Survey and some other state energy, the EIA's state energy demand data, and others. And we see on the left-hand side a pretty well-known fact that larger energy expenditures are associated with greater income. So higher income households use more energy. But as a share of their income, it's low-income households that spend a larger share and suffer from the energy equity dilemma. So a cap and invest policy recognizes that can be designed to recognize that the burden on a household of the energy transformation can fall greatest on low-income households, and so taking that to front and center and building a policy around that can help achieve fairness goals. And so now I want to approach that in two steps. First, make the economic case for efficiency, and then make the design case for how fairness can be achieved. The economic case for cap and invest begins with compliance flexibility. That is, we can reduce the overall burden, economic burden, by achieving emission reductions cost effectively. And so cap and invest allows the market to determine when, where, and how emission reductions are achieved. And then it equalizes incentives, not reductions, across sectors and across entities within a sector. So those for whom it's the least cost to achieve emission reductions are given incentive to do so, and to do so as much as possible. It encourages innovation across the energy sector, including ultimately incentives for negative emissions technologies, and then, importantly, it creates revenues. So this is showing what might be expected under a modest $25 carbon price, if such a price were to emerge under Maryland's Cap and Invest program. And the information is arrayed by income quintile, quintile 1 through quintile 5, quintile 1 being lowest income households. And I'm just showing for two sectors, transportation and buildings here, that let's see, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor, Mark? Great. So for households in the lowest income quintile, they would see and if there was, this is a very conservative or cautious estimate, because we're assuming no adjustment on the part of those households, just like a snapshot in recent years of what their expenditures were. They haven't yet taken advantage of any of the investments that we expect to be manifest under this program. They would see an increase of about $54 per year, or just over $4 a month, in the average cost of their transportation activities. And to compensate that household would require, for those change in expenditures, would require about 11% of the total revenues that are achieved in the transportation sector. To do households for the bottom two quintiles, or 40% of the lowest income households in the state, would require less than 30% of the revenues that are raised for falling out of the transportation sector. And analogously for buildings, it also would be less than 30% of the revenues that would be collected associated with emissions and emissions intensity of heating and cooling buildings. So that means that over 70% of the revenue that would be collected would be available for goals such as investments to accelerate decarbonization and to achieve other types of coordination and fairness goals of build out infrastructure, etc. Now, there's one important caveat in this. We're describing the average household within each of these groups. But they're in the bottom quintile, there may be some households that don't own a car and rely only on public transportation, and their expenditures may be less. And there might be households that have two cars, and they're older cars, and somebody in the family has to drive a long way to work. And then you have a family for which this is underestimate of the impact on that family. And so one of the challenges in designing a cap and invest program is thinking through how different types of incentives and compensation schemes can be structured in order to reach as much as possible households across those groups. Now I want to just go through, as I sort of race to the finish line, Mark, I want to go through some key design options and a couple other slides about questions that have to be addressed in standing up a cap and invest program. And they include setting the cap, which is more than just saying what is the state's goal in a given year, because it's important to think through the emissions pathway that's going to be realized over time from now until the state's long-term emissions goals. and identifying the covered entities, the covered sectors that are going to be included under that cap. Typically, the cap, well, always, the cap does not cover all the greenhouse gas emissions in the state's inventory, because many emissions, industrial gases or emissions from natural and working lands, cannot be monitored and enforced in real time. So they're not forgotten. They remain part of the state's overall project, and indeed some direct investments in those other areas may be made possible from the cap and invest program. But the cap, so part of the challenge here is to identify those sources that are be covered by an enforceable cap that will provide incentive for them driving down emissions. And the question about prioritizing emission reductions in overburdened communities, we've done some work on that and would love to revisit that topic at length. The question about investment of auction proceeds, the question of identifying the role for emissions offsets. Emission offsets are credit for some type of change in emissions that occur outside of the market. They kind of fall into two categories. There's avoided emissions and there's mitigation. And offsets are a controversial topic, and that controversy mostly revolves around avoided emissions because of the challenge of saying, well, what is really an avoided emissions? And this is done differently on all the different programs throughout North America. And just I read in Politico just earlier this week that New York State is on the track to decide not to allow offsets under its expected cap and invest program, but that there still are, as I said, emissions that occur outside of the cap, and so they're not forgotten, they're just not credited under the cap. And then the question of linking with other programs. An important issue for, I imagine, many folks that are on this call right now, and for anybody, households and businesses in Maryland, is about cost management. So how, people who are in the room now are saying, well, how do we know that if we launch this vessel, that we know where it's going to go and what costs are going to be? And there's several design elements that are meant specifically to address this. First of all, of course, is trading. The element of trading introduces cost effectiveness and is the single most important thing for keeping down the cost of achieving emission reductions. That's really what the economists like to think. That's the big benefit of adding cap and invest on top of other regulatory programs. Banking allows flexibility across time, so it allows a business to rationalize when it's going to make different types of investments. Recognizing that the cumulative emissions is what matters for climate change, an easy first-year cap can be very helpful because it enables the compliance entities to learn about how the program works and to build up a bank, and then they become, because they hold a bank, they become vested in the longevity of the program and begin to do a better job planning for the future. And it can avoid the problem of price spikes in the first year of the program, which has occurred many times. But in general, the bigger problem, believe it or not, for cost management is not high prices, it's been low prices. Low prices because, we think that these programs do what they're anticipated to do, which is help to identify low-cost emission reductions that maybe otherwise could not be specifically found by regulation. And also sometimes these programs get captured. And we need to guard against the possibility that the program isn't as strict as we want it to be. And so these programs are now designed with price floors and price steps so that when the price is low, fewer allowances enter the market and supply is actually constrained. And one of the good ways that this can happen is if other regulations do what we hope they're going to do. If other regulations are successful in driving EV investments or heat pump investments in buildings, then that's going to push down the price in the cap and invest market. And then as a consequence, this mechanism will issue fewer allowances. It's a sort of a ratchet effect that supports the program from unanticipated low prices, which has been in program after program the bigger challenge in the long run. But for those who are doing business in the state, they might be particularly concerned about, well, yeah, that sounds good and well, but what about the possibility that there's a fuel supply disruption or something and prices go high? And so these programs typically also have allowance reserves such that additional allowances could enter on a short-term basis, on a rapid basis, in order to give buoyancy to the program to any kind of unexpected change in economic activity. We have forward auctions to help firms plan for the future. We talked about offsets, which, if they were to be allowed, they are often a low-cost compliance option. Linking can be another way to reduce costs. And then finally, even though we try to design this program to be self-sufficient, and in open water, it can sail by itself, it is nonetheless always going to be subject to regular program reviews. And during those program reviews, adjustments can be made if necessary to deal with costs. Administration is, there's a lot of details there that we won't get into now, but I just want to mention 3 or 4 of these. First of all, the allowance tracking system is something that Maryland will have lots of experience with already. The state and entities in the state have participated in the federal sulfur dioxide emissions trading program, which started under the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments and nationally reduced sulfur dioxide, helped reduce the sulfur dioxide emissions from 16 million tons to 1 million ton currently. The NOx budget program also. There's lots of high experience and help in terms of the allowance tracking system. Points of obligation is worth lingering on, because I don't want people thinking that somehow what we're doing is setting up a program that sends a bill to households every month or something like that. That's not the way the program gets organized. Instead, the compliance entities, those responsible for compliance, are upstream. So it's a natural gas fuel supplier or the refiner or transporter for gasoline that is the one who has the compliance obligation, not the individual household. But the two that I'll just end with, these two that are in blue, are the really important elements of success for these programs. And that is, we've learned so much about how to run these allowance auctions, and they're very simple, really almost a trivial administrative cost, both for firms and for the state. And then it's what yields the revenues. But there is a case to be made, that can be made, for the distribution of some free allowances. And that is, if there is energy intensive, trade exposed industries in the state that otherwise might be faced with the dilemma of having to leave the state because it would be cheaper to do business across the state border. And there's no gain economically or environmentally if they were to leave the state just because of this cost burden and potentially go to a state which has more lax environmental rules. So this is a surgical consideration, one that should be used very sparingly, but it does have potentially an important role. Let me just go down to the last slide. Something that the state's going to want to consider is the potential for linking with other programs. And there's a number, I know you've heard about Washington State, and there's a number of other North American programs in place. There are some significant potential benefits of linking, including greater cost effectiveness, formation of prices across the markets, and stability, because if you have a broader market, then any kind of economic change in economic activity in Maryland isn't going to have, it's not going to have such a whipsaw effect in terms of demand for allowances in the short run if Maryland is linked with a larger market. It also helps mitigate leakage risks to the extent that linking gets bigger and bigger. And there's administrative and policy coordination gains, and more to be said about this. But probably I would say is generally an advocate for linking, but with everything received with eyes wide open, the most compelling reason to think about linking is to send a stronger policy signal nationally, because we can't accomplish it by doing this just in the state of Maryland, obviously, or just in the states that are currently doing carbon pricing. We need a national and global effort. And so I'm sorry if I went a little bit longer than I intended, but that's what I've got, and I'll stop sharing now. If I can figure it out.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure that people are going to have questions for you and your team when we get to the discussion portion. But yeah, just a reminder for everyone, please do hold your good questions, and we'll be sure to dedicate most of the next hour to that. If the presentation that you just heard sounds complicated and overwhelming, rest assured, Maryland has more than a decade of experience participating in a cap and invest program called the Regional greenhouse gas initiative, our power plants have been participating in Cap and Invest for a long time now, linked with other states. This is a program design that MDE has quite a bit of familiarity with because of that. So Dallas, thank you, and I appreciate you and your folks holding on for the discussion session. I'm going to turn things over to Wandra Ashley Williams from Climate Exchange to discuss the Climate Crisis and Environmental Justice Act. So Wandra, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm happy to screen share if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Great.
Just testing my mic. Is it working? Good. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me make sure I got the right one here. There we go.
That's it. Thank you, Mark. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about the Climate Crisis and Environmental Justice Act. We call it the CCEJ. As you know, it is a carbon pricing policy. If you want to go to the next slide, please. That supports the new statewide greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal of achieving 60% GHG emissions by 2021. We did discuss this earlier. Mark discussed all of this earlier, so I won't go into detail. But another thing that the CCEJ does is establish two types of fossil fuel fees to help protect us. The other one is to generate revenue from the fossil fuel fee to help protect underserved, overburdened, and low and moderate income households, as well as energy-intensive businesses from financial harm. So those are the three objectives of the CCEJ. The next slide, please. The CCEJ fee, in Maryland, implementing a state carbon fee and dividend policy such as the Climate Crisis and Environmental Justice Act will set Maryland on a pathway to reach the new statewide greenhouse gas emission reduction goal set by the Climate Solutions Now Act, as we know, of 2022, as well as outlined in the administration's climate pollution reduction plan. The plan blueprint suggests that we will need approximately $1 billion annually to cover the cost of implementing the plan. It also goes on to say that those funds will have to come from new funding sources. The CCEJ is expected to raise an average of $1.25 billion per year once fully implemented. Next slide, please. So, excuse me, the fee on fossil fuel that's brought into the state for combustion in the state. So the fee is collected at the fossil fuel's first entry into the state, the first point of entry into the state. It is paid by the entity transporting the fossil fuel into our state, and the fee is charged on natural gas, petroleum, and coal. Next slide, please. So here, and I hope you can see this, I don't know if we can enlarge that if necessary, Mark, but there's a diagram that shows how this fee is charged. It's a gradual fee that starts on the non-transportation fuel, which is building heat. It starts at $30 a ton and increases $5 a year, and it is capped at $75 a ton. The blue numbers that you see, that's for transportation fuel. That will start at $25 a ton and increased $3 a ton and capped at $52 a ton. It's worth mentioning that the capped amount is $75 a ton for the non-transportation fuel, and for the transportation fuel, the $52 a ton will be capped and kept there until we meet our target reduction. Next slide, please. So with the revenue, we will establish two separate funds, a green infrastructure fund and a household and employee benefits fund. The pie, the blue side of the pie, is the benefits fund. The benefits fund, 50% of the revenue will go to the benefits fund, and it will go to underserved, overburdened, low and moderate income households. And the 20% will go to energy intense businesses. The pink side, future side of the pie, is our green infrastructure fund. In that fund, we have revenue for fossil fuel, will generate billions of dollars in revenue. And 50% of that fund will be targeted to the same environmental justice communities that we discussed in the benefits fund. It will go to those communities to invest in projects that are directly located within and provide meaningful benefits to those environmental justice communities. Next slide, please. There is a no pass-through provision in this bill. And the no pass-through provision says that the fee cannot be passed down as a direct cost to an end user or a fossil fuel, or a customer of a gas company. So next slide, please. I want to talk about the household impacts from the CCEJ. The CCEJ is designed to enact progressive benefit across households that avoid undue or regressive cost burdens. We have a chart where you can see the impact of the CCEJ. Currently, the average household spends $346 monthly. The impact of the CCEJ would be $32 if that no pass-through does not hold. The CCEJ rebate is $32 to that same household. So therefore, there's a zero net impact of this policy. These rebates are distributed progressively, as I stated before, by income quintiles, which Dallas kind of talked about earlier. And so we're targeting not just low and moderate income households, because we know that environmental justice communities are not all low and moderate income. And so we were intentional in putting in the underserved and overburdened communities as well. So these rebates take place whether or not a no cost pass-through provision is enforced. Next slide, please. So we have to pay to implement this bill or any policy that we enact. And so provided in this legislation is an administrative cost of 5%. So 5% of the about a billion point two will equal to about $63.5 million annually. And if you read the fiscal notes for the last bill that was introduced, HB 516, MDE advises that it would take approximately $5.5 to $6.3 million. And this is just an estimate because it's kind of hard to determine the cost now. But the CCEJ, the 5% that's allocated in the CCEJ will more than compensate for the cost to implement this bill. But I will say that all of the funds that are not used of that $63 million will go back to the benefits fund and the infrastructure fund. Next slide, please. And I think that's it. So I want to close with one thought, and then I will address the hypothetical solution that you shared with us, Mark. The CCEJ is predictable for the fossil fuel companies as well as for the state of Maryland. It provides essential, new, vital revenue that the state is in dire need of. If we're to reach our GHG goal that we are legally bound to, this is one policy, one mechanism that will definitely work. However, I do know that there's several that have been introduced, several bills were introduced last year, and people are talking about other ways of doing this. And I think it's fantastic that our state has gotten to that point where we realize that we need to charge the fossil fuel companies, those who have really created the damage that we have to our country and to our state, and make them pay. And that is what is important. So I will say this, I think that the solution that you suggest and how we can sort of tie all three of the these policies together, I don't disagree with them. I just feel that one thing we have to do is make sure that we address 3 points that the CCEJ does, right? Charge the polluters, that is, and not the taxpayers. Polluters need to pay, and we need to figure out a way to do that, and a way to do it legally where we're not in litigation for years to come. Keep Justice 40 in mind as we're doing this. We should not be solving this problem on the back of those who have suffered the most. And that is a concern that a lot of the environmental justice communities, civil rights communities have. Yes, the revenue can definitely be directed to those communities. And in some states that have cap and invest, cap and trade, they're doing that. But the fee itself is still being passed down to the end users, to the consumers, to the ratepayers. And some of us can afford that. Many of us cannot in our state. And we have to protect our vulnerable communities. And so that is a major concern that I have, that on the front end, whatever policy we implement, we design, whatever policy we design, on the front end, we make that a priority. That we compensate if we can't do a no pass-through. If the no pass-through does not hold, then we have that benefits fund that is going to compensate those same households for any increase in fee that they might receive. And I will stay on for any questions you have later. Thank you.
Wanda, thank you very much for that presentation. We're going to go to Delegate Dana Stein. I think, unless your schedule has changed, Mr. Delegate, that you may have a hard stop around 2. So without further ado, I'll bring up your slides.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, actually, I could stay on to 2:30, but we'll have to drop off then. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about legislation that I put in last year, very likely to put it again this year, that would establish a fossil fuel transportation fee. And the bill from 2024 that I put in was House Bill 1008. There were a number of amendments that were agreed to, which are reflected in sort of my presentation as I go through it. But you know, if you go online to the General Assembly website, just click on HB 1008. You won't see the amendments there, but happy to provide anyone who would like the actual amendment language. So in terms of the overview, this bill would implement one of the recommendations that was specified in the Climate Pollution Reduction Plan. And specifically, the plan suggested creating a hazardous substance fee, which would require companies to pay a fee for the hazardous substances transported in the state, including fossil fuels used in or exported from the state, based on a fee rate set by the government. The proposed bill focuses on coal and natural gas. It does replicate an existing fee on oil that's maintained by MDE, and it's collected and put it into a fund called the Oil Disaster Containment, Cleanup, and Contingency Fund. But because there is this existing fee on oil products, the proposed fee under this bill would not apply to those, and the bill makes that very clear. So the specific fee would be 30 cents per million BTUs, and it would be levied against a carrier of coal and gas brought into the state. And through an amendment, we made clear that utilities, which of course transport natural gas through their distribution systems to customers, they are excluded from this fee unless they are the first carrier to bring coal or gas into the state. And the fiscal note estimated that it would generate between $250 to $300 million every year, primarily from exporters. And when we get to the slides coupled down in the slide deck, you'll see sort of how the data shows that the majority of this revenue would be generated for fees paid by exporters, and it would be used to fund mitigation activities that are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions consistent with the Climate Pollution Reduction Plan. Okay, maybe we can go to the next slide. So in terms of exemptions and other amendments, the bill specifically says that fuel that is used for agricultural purposes is exempted. It also exempts products that travel through the state and transit to other states. So for example, if you have a truck that picks up coal in Pennsylvania, happens to pass through Maryland on its way to Virginia or some other state for delivery, that product is not subject to the fee. And as I mentioned before, it also exempts fossil fuels that are subject to the existing MDE fee, which includes gasoline, diesel, heating oil, and the bill makes this, through an amendment, makes a specific reference, COMAR reference, to the fuels that are subject to the fee, existing fee, that accordingly would be exempt from this fee. And also propane and liquefied petroleum gas are also exempt from the proposed fee. And in recognition of the importance of Justice 40, we did put into the bill's requirement that 40% of the revenue that's collected be directed to address impacts in overburdened and underserved communities. So we can go to the next slide. So this, I don't know, Mark, is there any way to make it a little bit bigger, or if that's the largest it goes?
I attempted that when Wander was presenting and I failed. So sorry.
Well, maybe we can send all of these slides out. But what this does, it provides information about, with respect to coal and natural gas. It also has petroleum, though petroleum is exempted. With respect to coal and natural gas, the units of both coal and natural gas, which are brought into the state for consumption and then also for export. So you'll see, well, or if you have better vision than I do, but I've seen the slide before, so I know what it says. For coal, for example, large majority of the coal that is brought into the state is exported. In fact, exported coal would represent 43% of the total revenue generated under this bill. 6% of the fee would be generated by coal that's consumed in the state. Natural gas, it's a little bit more evenly split, but nonetheless, let's see, I think it's 23% is 20% of the fee would be generated by natural gas that is exported from the state. This particular slide says that the total revenue would be more than $300. I think taking into account some exclusions we have in the bill, for example, agricultural products, a couple other things. Fiscal note said, again, the revenue would be between $250 and $300 million each year that's generated. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. The next slide provides data on consumer impact. The first column shows a range of fees, and with this sort of the darker rectangle around the proposed fee under the bill, again, 30 cents per million BTUs, what the impact would be. And it is very small. It is for kilowatt hours. I'll have to rely on memory here. I think it's 0.0005 cents per kilowatt hour and 0.03 cents per therm of gas. So it is pretty small, but again, it generates a substantial amount of revenue because of the amount of coal and natural gas that's brought into the state, again, most of which is exported. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So in terms of key considerations, with respect to the impact on consumers, well, 60% of Marylanders don't use gas to heat their homes, so would be unaffected by any marginal gas rate increase that would be caused by this fee. Ratepayer impact would be minimal for those in gas. And, with the way, looking at sort of fluctuations within the market price of natural gas, it would sort of be captured within the normal volatility of fluctuations of market prices. And again, oil would not be covered, so there's no oil price impact. Projection is that the average monthly electric bill impact in Maryland would be 50 cents. Average monthly gas bill impact is $1.88. And again, this is looking at residential impact. And depending on how the legislature, if it were to move forward with this, were to look at possibly addressing impact on LMI households, then certainly they could be mitigated by the fund that would be set up under the bill. Okay, next slide. And some other considerations. The proposal, this revenue proposal is somewhat unique in that it would capture revenue from fossil fuels used in the state, consumed in the state, and exported from Maryland. And again, it's approximately 2/3 of the revenue that would be generated under this proposal is generated from exports, with the balance about 1/3 generated through consumption of coal and natural gas within the state. In terms of other precedents, New Jersey charges a fee to transport hazardous substances through the state. And, it's worth noting that states that are, coal rich or gas rich, produce fossil fuels, they collect huge revenue through extraction taxes. And that's regardless of whether, the fuel that is extracted in those states is used in state or sent out of state or out of the country. So in this sense, that it's somewhat, this proposed fee is somewhat analogous to that. So that ends my presentation, and look forward to any questions. And again, apologies in advance for having to leave at 2:30. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Delegate, and we're happy that you're able to join us until 2:30. So that's wonderful. All right, so last but certainly not least in our lineup of presenters is Jamie DeMarco, Maryland Director at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, to talk about the RENEW Act. Jamie, thanks for joining us. Not hearing you. You are unmuted, so it might be a mic choice issue.
Me now.
Yep, we hear you now.
All right. Now we have that away. I'm going to try sharing my screen in hopes that that will make it bigger, because it seemed bigger when our first presenter was presenting. Can folks see this?
Not yet.
No.
No. Okay.
I'm happy to.
Why don't you share my slides?
Okie dokie, will do. Hold a second.
Great, thank you. Well, as Mark said, my name is Jamie DeMarco. I'm the Maryland Director at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. We are a regional nonprofit advocacy organization. And I want to talk about the Responding to Emergency Needs from Extreme Weather Act, or the RENEW Act. This was introduced this past year by Senator Hester and by Delegate Fraser-Hidalgo and Delegate Balafo. It was co-sponsored by a majority of the Democratic caucus in both chambers. And the problem is big. As previous folks have said, the governor's climate pollution reduction plan says that to meet our climate goals, we need to invest $1 billion a year, every year between now and 2031 to meet those goals. But the problem is actually bigger and harder than that, because in addition to that investment, which is necessary to reduce emissions and get ourselves off of fossil fuels, we also have rising costs from climate impacts that the state is currently experiencing. And that is hotter hots, that is heavier rains, that is higher tides, all of which are coming due in very real ways for municipalities and state government. We have a projected budget shortfall, and contributing to that shortfall is these increasingly extreme weather events. And what the RENEW Act does really well is it recovers funding for these climate damages, which we are currently paying, takes that financial burden off of Marylanders and off of Maryland taxpayers and puts it squarely on the shoulders of the international fossil fuel companies that knew and lied about this crisis for decades. There's about 40 of them. We'll get into that. And there is a lot of overlap between addressing the needs to responding to emergency needs from extreme weather and also reducing our greenhouse gas pollution. For example, installing air conditioning in public schools that need it. When you do that, if you install a heat pump, you can also take that school off of gas. And so there's a lot of overlap. But I want to get into some of the very concrete ways in which all of us are currently paying for the cost of climate change. Next slide. This, of course, is Ellicott City that experienced 2 once-in-a-thousand-year rain events within the span of 2 years. As a result of this, the Howard County government is currently spending over $200 million to bore an 18-foot diameter drainage tunnel through granite bedrock underneath Ellicott City to handle that stormwater runoff, 18 feet in diameter. So Mark could stand on my shoulders and Kim could stand on Mark's shoulders and Kim's head would still not touch the top of that tunnel. And it is all for stormwater runoff. That's just one example of a climate cost. Next slide. And we are also seeing sea level rise. This is a picture of a farm, a cornfield. And in previous years, this cornfield would have been uniform. Corn would have been growing everywhere at equal heights. As you can see, there's this white stuff on the ground and places where no corn is growing. That's actually salt from saltwater intrusion. So there are people who are losing income today on the Eastern Shore and throughout Maryland because of saltwater intrusion into their property. And the same thing is happening to septic systems. People are trying to get their septic systems renewed, and land that used to percolate no longer percolates. And that can be extremely expensive to find an alternative to a septic system for wastewater. We also know in Annapolis, the sea level rise has chronically inundated the dock, and the city of Annapolis is spending more than $80 million renovating that dock to handle increased flooding events. Next slide. We also know that extreme heat is really deadly. Extreme heat is actually one of the highest killing weather events, even though it's not necessarily as dramatic as a tornado or a hurricane. It kills at higher numbers, and it's especially deadly in communities that have been historically redlined, where there is a lack of tree cover. And those are the hottest parts of a heat island. We know that, in the past school year, both in September and in June, public schools had to close because it was unsafe to go to school in the extreme weather. The air conditioning systems either didn't exist in schools or they were inadequate to meet the extreme weather. Schools like City College has existed for over 100 years without an air conditioning system, but is now needing to have one installed. It's going to cost Maryland more than $700 million just to install air conditioning in all the public schools that need it. So that's a $700 million investment that's needed over and on top of the blueprint investment we are already making in our public education. And of course, the greatest health threat from the combustion of fossil fuels is somewhat climate related because it is more exacerbated by heat, but the most deadly effect is definitely from air pollution. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that not everyone experiences air pollution evenly. As you can see, Black Americans are exposed to higher levels of air pollution from every source across the board, and people of color are exposed to higher levels of air pollution from most sources. So these effects are not being felt equally. So all of this is happening now, and it's costing people health and financial resources today. If you go to the next slide, we now have a choice as Maryland. These large international fossil fuel companies knew and lied about this crisis and have been emitting for decades. As a result, we are facing financial costs that are due today and impacting our budget in real ways, not in projected ways, not in anticipated ways, but in real this year's fiscal line item budget ways. So we have two options. One, we can either not pass the Renew Act, and in that case, Maryland taxpayers will continue to bear the burden of these costs that have to be paid one way or another. There's no option of not paying these costs. Or the alternative is that we pass the Renew Act and have these financial costs met by a one-time fee of $9 billion paid over 10 years for necessary infrastructure upgrades from the largest international fossil fuel companies. The way the bill would work is it says if you are a company and you have emitted more than 1 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions between the period of 2000 and say 2022, then you have to pay into this fund. And in total, the fund would raise $900 million a year for 10 years. And that funding would then go to everything that we need, including mitigation and adaptation costs. And making communities whole, it would also have a 40% commitment to going to the most underserved communities in the Justice 40 commitment. Next slide. This approach is based on a Superfund model. It's not technically a Superfund because this would be a state bill, but it is on that same approach. We've been doing this for decades. There's multiple Superfunds in Maryland already, where a small group of companies have polluted a specific site, knowing that their product was going to pollute it, and then have then been required to pay into a fund to mitigate the impacts of that pollution. This is the exact same legal approach, except in this case, the site that has been contaminated is the global atmosphere. This approach was first introduced anywhere in any legislative body by Senator Van Hollen, who brought this idea to Congress in the 2021-2022 Congress. And it very nearly became part of the Build Back Better agenda. Build Back Better shrank, became Inflation Reduction Act, and it didn't need as many revenue raisers. And when that happened, it went to the states. If you go to the next slide, you can see this is taking off. This policy is now passed in Vermont with bipartisan supermajorities in both chambers, and the Republican governor there chose not to veto it. So this policy is going to affect in Vermont, and we also know that in New York, this has passed the legislature and awaits the governor's signature. She's not made a final decision, but we feel confident that she will sign this bill. So we would not be the first state to take this step. We have other states leading the way, and it is a growing trend. A lot of people are realizing that it makes sense to say yes to free money. And Marylanders know that as well. If you go to the next slide, Gonzalez did a poll where they asked folks, would you support legislation in Maryland that would invest in bridges, electrical grids, and other infrastructures to make us able to withstand the impacts of climate change and ensure big oil and gas companies pay for the costs? 68% said yes, only 29% opposed. So more than a 2-to-1 support ratio. That's one poll. An entirely separate poll was done by Data for Progress. If you go to the next slide. And in this poll, this policy idea has support 73-to-21. The idea that if you make a mess, you clean it up is really universal, and people get it. It clicks with people, and people support it intuitively, which is part of why it's been catching on and passing in multiple states this year. Next slide. This is a list of the companies that would pay into this fund. As you can see, none of these companies are based in Maryland. All of them have operations in Maryland. If a company has operations in Maryland, sells its product in Maryland, then we have the legal authority to require them to pay. And all of these companies sell their product in Maryland. Because oil is sold as a global commodity, it's impossible to say, I want to sell this oil, I'm going to refine it, I'm going to distribute it, put it into the Colonial Pipeline where we get all our oil and the East Coast gets its oil, but say, oh, but make sure none of it ends up in Maryland. That's simply not how the operations work. But this is only about 40 companies who would be paying into this, and there are hundreds of oil extractors, refiners, distributing companies. It would be for market reasons, it would be impossible for these companies to pass costs on to consumers because the other companies not listed here are not paying this price. And they're not going to raise their rates. And so these companies would be forced by market competition to not raise their prices. You don't have to take my word for it. If you go to the next slide, the Institute for Policy Integrity, which is a part of New York University School of Law, studied this issue at length, and they have a policy paper called Enacting the Polluter Pays Principle. And they found that this cost would be highly unlikely to be passed on for two reasons. One, it is a one-time sunk cost based on historical actions. It's not based on annual sales or current sales or future sales. And only a small subsection of companies are having to pay for it. And we've done this already. We have multiple super funds in Maryland where a small subsection of the companies that have a market share, but not a complete market share of a product, have to pay into a fund. And we have not seen those super funds raise the cost of products that those companies sell. If you go to the next slide, you can see these lines of text. It's kind of hard to read, but it talks about how, one, this is a sunk cost based on historical actions, and two, only a subsection of the market share of these companies is going to be paying it. You can think of it more as if a company had to settle in court for a lawsuit, and a few companies had to settle in court for a lawsuit and paid a one-time payment, they would not then be able to raise the price of that commodity across the economy because their market competition would not be paying that price. If you go to the next slide, it would invest in a lot of great things. Maryland currently has a state disaster relief fund that was created 2 years ago, but the state disaster relief fund has no money in it, which is a minor detail, but an important one. And it would put funds into it. This is really important. It would be Maryland's FEMA, essentially. And it can take time for FEMA to arrive. There's thresholds below which FEMA doesn't come. If a tornado comes through a community, we want Maryland government to be able to be responding the very next day. Go to the next slide. We'll just run through these really quick. You can also invest in the Strategic Energy Investment Fund. Insulation is absolutely climate adaptation. Next slide. You can also invest in the Zero Emission Bus Transition Fund. Next slide. And the Comprehensive Flood Mitigation Fund to protect people from floods. Next slide. It also put funds into the Office of Minority Health Disparities to make sure that anyone who goes to the hospital with heat stroke has quality, affordable health care. Next slide. And it would also help agencies like DNR, who's on the call today, hire staff, because we know that having abundant quality staff is essential to all state programs. We really believe in staff capacity. I just want to list some of the positive things that it would invest in, along with the other decarbonization requirements that we've talked about, like installing heat pumps to cover cooling and heating needs without the use of fossil fuels. Next slide. So I like to end on this slide that we can be whatever we have the courage to see. This is a policy in which we, as state of Maryland, would be getting a check. No one who lives in Maryland would have to pay an additional cent, and we would be getting $900 million a year for 10 years to cover the cost of climate adaptation and mitigation. We think that this is an important approach. We think it can't be the only approach. We need to raise revenue in more direct and conventional ways, like the climate pollution fee that Delegate Stein was talking about, as well as the Climate Crisis and Environmental Justice Act, Cap and Invest. I think we need an all of the above approach, but we think this is an essential policy that needs to be passed in 2025 in order to meet the rising cost of climate change and to do it equitably. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. And thank you to all the presenters. That brings us to the discussion period, and where we wanted to start the discussion was with some reaction from representatives from the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. So we have Tom Ballantyne, Vice President for Policy and Government Relations at NIOP, representing commercial real estate, and Scott Waitlerbich, Manager of Government Relations at Columbia Gas. And I see Tom unmuting, so I guess, Tom, do you want to take it away? And I'll be happy to share slides for you if you want.
Actually, Mark, our plan was for Scott to go first, if you don't mind.
Yes, so, yep, Mark, please bring up the slides. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss these tax policy ideas this afternoon. As was mentioned, Tom and I are here representing the Maryland Chamber as members of the Energy Environment Policy Committee, who has taken a look at these policies, and you know, we'd like to provide some comments. So first of all, let me start with you know, the notion that you know, the business community understands the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Regulated entities and the public, you know, need cost-effective, technically feasible pathways to achieve the state's ambitious emission reduction targets. At the same time, the state and local governments are seeking funding as well for climate mitigation. We have the education blueprint and transportation funding needs also in the mix. So really coordinated management of financing all these priorities is essential to limiting emissions leakage and maintaining the state's competitive economic position. Let me start with the proposal creating Cap and Invest, especially when it's calibrated to the 60% by 2031 emissions reduction target. The Chamber believes could result in abrupt and sharp price increases for electricity, heating, and transportation fuels before the transition opportunities are readily accessible. Regulated entities and consumers must have the necessary time, incentives, and regulatory flexibility to access feasible compliance alternatives. The experience with Cap and Invest in Washington State, as we understand it, you know, was marked by a 40-cent per gallon increase in the gasoline prices, a volatile emissions allowance market, unpredictability in high revenues, unclear emission reductions, and eroding public support. It really raises questions about the advisability of adopting a Washington State model here in Maryland. Ultimately, we encourage the Mitigation Working Group and other policymakers to focus on low-cost, high-impact policies to work towards our greenhouse gas reduction goals. So let me turn it over to Tom for additional comments.
Mark, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Ballantyne with NIOP Maryland. As was said previously, we're a commercial real estate trade association with chapters in the Baltimore and DC markets, and outside of the state, we're also in most of the major markets in the US and Canada. As it relates to these proposals, our member companies are more consumers. We're in the respect that we don't operate facilities that might be directly impacted. So when we look at these kinds of carbon proposals, we try to anticipate how they'll interact with a building energy performance standard, other elements of the plan, and the costs of building operations. I think we, as an organization, and most business organizations, subscribe to the school of thought that a carbon price is a powerful financial lever that can change behavior and raise revenues. Under the ideal conditions, you know, around our table, we see that trading and fee programs and other other contexts can provide faster, less expensive compliance options for regulated entities, but that depends on how and in this case, the carbon price interacts with more prescriptive performance requirements and how much time or regulatory flexibility regulated entities have. Large buildings in Maryland are already required to reach net zero direct emissions by 2040. That's 5 years faster than the statewide economy and faster than buildings in other leading states. That's a daunting requirement. I think as consumers, when we look at the pathway model and try and anticipate how a carbon fee would affect us, the carbon fee in the pathways model was used to draw down the use of natural gas powered electricity generation in the state and eventually close it by about 2030. So we've learned from the Brandon Shores example that the closure date of power stations are dependent on many factors, and it raises questions for us about how a cap and invest program with the automatic accelerators in it would respond in that case. Will the public be in a position to avoid those additional costs if they wish to, or not? The corresponding change in the pathway model is a significant increase in imported electricity, and the price and emissions values of that future imported electricity is uncertain at this point. And when we talk about seeking revenues to cover the $1 billion per year in cost, those are the state's estimated costs. And I would urge the working group and other policymakers to keep in mind MD's previous estimate that the economy-wide compliance costs, which mostly apply to private entities, could be as much as $15 billion per year. Put in perspective, that's about what the general operating budgets of all the counties and the city of Baltimore were in 2020. So turning to the slide quickly, the questions to consider are generally related to understanding the to the slide that you already had up, Mark. Yep, there we go. They're generally related to understanding near-term costs and revenue requirements to meet the 60 by 31. The first bullet is pricing of emission allocations. There was a MEA study in 2022 that estimated a carbon price starting at $80 a ton would enable a 50% emissions reduction by 2030. The market prices in Washington State were predicted to start around $20 a ton to achieve a 45% reduction by 2030. But auction clearance prices were much higher and ranged between $50 and $70 a ton by the fall of 2023. So for us, it brings forward the question, how high would the carbon price need to be in order to achieve the 60 by 31 requirements in the CSNA? In terms of consumer costs, how does that translate through to electricity, heating, transportation fuels in the time between now and 2031? The rule of thumb that we've been exposed to is that every $10 per ton carbon price translates to 10 cents a gallon for retail gasoline at the pump, but that doesn't really tell us much about what the electricity and the natural gas and other heating fuels would look like. How do these costs have to increase over time? The Washington State Cap and Investment Plan reduced available emission allowances by 7% per year, but it was targeted to a lower reduction, a 45% reduction by 2030. So what downward trajectory do we need in Maryland and need to anticipate when we're thinking about whether this is the appropriate approach for us to reach the 60 by 31 target? The deployment of carbon price revenues, there's not much time between now and the target dates, and it can be done quickly. How much money can be raised in the interim? And then the question of leakage and competitiveness, because almost any service provided in Maryland can be located in a neighboring state, and we're already lagging the national average in neighboring states in GDP, employment, personal income growth. So we're seeing, our members losing potential tenants to Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Utah, other places, because they look attractive in comparison. So the concern is that unilaterally adopting these kinds of revenue measures, carbon taxes, would be more expensive and would erode our competitive position if others were not willing to participate with us as they have in the RGGI example. So I'll leave it there. I think you want to turn the agenda to more discussion, so I appreciate the time to speak, and I'll stay on the line.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Tom, thanks. I think we just had a couple more points we wanted to cover that, you know, as the Maryland Chamber looked at these proposals, its tax policy committee, its legislative committee, just to, you know, give a high level overview. And, you know, we got into detail about cap and invest, but certainly the cost on the economy is a significant concern to the business community. The Climate Crisis and Environmental Justice Act, you know, concerns are increased costs on energy, the cost burden on those relying on fossil fuels for their daily activities, especially like those that are living paycheck to paycheck. For example, in Western Maryland, where my company is located, the United Way estimates that 26,000 households are what's called living in the ALICE threshold, asset limited, income constrained, but they're employed. So any cost, you know, that they may incur because of these tax proposals is going to adversely affect them. The fossil fuel transportation fee, again, same aspect of increased energy cost and on fossil fuels. And then the Renew Act, I know there's questions about the strict liability, the retroactive component of the bill, singling out the refining industry and, you know, potential complicated litigation that, you know, could occur if the legislation is passed. So as Tom mentioned, we're happy to stay on and, you know, answer any questions anyone may have.
Tom, thank you very much for those points. Quick note as I turn to Mike, Delegate Stein has maybe just 2 minutes left with us. So if there are any questions, first and foremost for Delegate Stein, that might be most judicious. Go ahead, Mike.
That's actually why I jumped in there real quick. I have one question for Dana and one question for Wanda. Dana, I know one of the issues that people kept talking about was whether coal being exported would instead be diverted to Norfolk. Do we have any data from the collapse of the Key Bridge that would show whether or not, because I have no idea, whether or not that's a real possibility or whether it's, you know, a hypothetical? I mean, have we looked at that issue?
No, that's a good question. The short answer is no, I haven't, but certainly I can do research into whether, you know, the Port of Baltimore has significant geographic advantages, you know, reducing, you know, transportation costs because we're so far inland. And, you know, so, but I don't know whether, you know, for example, the 2-month delay with the channel being closed is expected to lead any permanent diversion of exports to, say, Hampton Roads, or whether with the channel being back open, exporters are going to rely on that, you know, geographic advantage that the port has to, you know, swing exports back to the port. So bottom line is, I don't know, but it's a point that's worth looking into.
Gotcha. And then real quickly, Wanda, I think yours was the only proposal that had a no pass-through written into the legislation, but yours also, as I read it, would include regulated utilities. And I thought that you could not constitutionally forbid a regulated utility from passing through costs. Have you looked at that legally? Because that's the part I don't, and yours is the only one that forbid pass-through.
Yeah, we did meet with the Attorney General's office, and they reviewed all of that and said that they would defend the policy if it did end up being challenged. So, you know, we kind of relied on them for that. I guess that's pretty much all I can offer.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
A quick thanks to Delegate Stein for joining us today. I know that he has to run, so apologies if members had questions on that policy. As I noted earlier, we have a deadline of early September to attempt to formulate a recommendation aligned with these concepts or other funding ideas. So perhaps we'll have the opportunity as we go through the next couple months of meetings to have some of these fine folks back. I see a hand from Lewis. Go ahead, Lewis.
Thanks, Mark. So this question is for Dallas. Dallas, I'm wondering if you've seen any assessments. I know your presentation was really about cap and invest. If you've seen any comparisons on the pluses and minuses of a straight carbon tax relative to a cap and invest program, because they are different. And carbon taxing is very definitive, far less complex than the cap invest program. So I'm just wondering if you've seen anything that compares the two.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's frankly a voluminous literature that economists have spent 50 years debating a carbon tax versus an emissions cap. What I'll say about that is that these two policy approaches have really come to converge in the literature. The elementary criticism or concern about a carbon tax is that you don't know what the emissions outcome is going to be. The elementary concern about a cap is that, you specify what the emissions are, but you don't know what the cost is going to be. But that is really sort of a 50-year-old narrative about how to think about these two policy instruments. And we've done a lot of work, across academics, there's been a lot of work about how you can design a carbon tax to look more like a cap and trade program, and how you can design a cap and trade program to look more like a carbon tax, such that really it's sort of like the transcontinental railroad. They're meeting at a point in the middle that's sort of a hybrid policy. And what I was describing was a hybrid policy where what I would call price responsive allowance supply. There's an allowance supply that represents 1 allowance per ton, but the number of allowances that enter the market in any year or any quarter, for that matter, if it was associated with quarterly auctions, automatically adjusts to what the price is in the auction. And if you think about it, like the way I like to think about it is that we are talking about using a price, whether it's a tax or a market, to emulate what the efficiency of commodity markets, to get really efficient exchange going on. But if you think about a cap as it's like strictly a cap, then it's a one-sided market in which the supply doesn't adjust, only the demand for emission allowances. So that's why we not think about it as a price responsive allowance supply. You still have the long run goal, because it's cumulative emissions that really matter, not the emissions in any given quarter or week or whatever. But you have the ability to sort of ratchet in saving low cost and additional emission reductions when costs of doing so are low, and to enable the release of additional allowances when the costs are high. And so we've seen this kind of program design in place in RGGI in California. It's written into Washington State also, and they've these various mechanisms that get triggered, and then what it does is kind of gives the program buoyancy to respond to short-run disruptions and then get back on a long-term track. And then, of course, in the long term, there's always the prospect of a program review that could make larger changes. So I didn't mean to avoid the question about a tax versus a cap and trade approach or a market. Both are strong options, strong possibilities, but we really don't think about them as being very different anymore. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got hands up from several MWG and Climate Commission members, so I'll go to Mark Sibitz next.
Thanks, Mark. This is also a question for Dallas. Dallas, in your figure 2 from your report, which you showed in your presentation, it's household energy expenditures by fuel across Maryland income deciles. I think you said what the source of these data was, but could you say that again? And I ask just because both the expenditures and the share of income of expenditures for the lower decile seems at a glance to be pretty low. OPC, Office of People's Counsel, is used to looking at numbers expressed in terms of percentages of federal poverty level, which requires some translation between income decile. So I don't have anything here that directly contradicts what you're showing, but I'm curious if you could say it again. And also, I see the dollars are expressed in 2021 dollars. Are the data also all 2021 data?
Well, Mark, I really appreciate the question. And the primary source of this information is the Consumer Expenditure Survey, but we augment it with other information from EIA. And I would really welcome a direct email, and we would try to, make sure that we get aligned on this, because we want, want it to be as transparent as possible. So my email, if you don't have it, is my last name @rff.org, and we'll open up our spreadsheets and work with you to make sure that we're talking about the same thing.
Appreciate that. I will reach out. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Mark. Question about the relationship between Cap and Invest and voluntary clean energy purchases. So this is for Dallas. Dallas, you mentioned that there are ways to harmonize these programs, but this is of keen interest for customers of a company like Constellation. We do sell voluntary clean energy products to quite a few customers. So these clean energy purchases, those that can demonstrate regulatory surplus with respect to an RPS, how do we ensure those buyers can claim any associated emissions reductions? And is the sort of allocation of allowances done in some RGGI states the only viable approach?
That's a great question. And I understand 90% of it. Some of the folks on the call may understand less than that, but I'm really sympathetic to it. So if I can reframe it, Brian, from a broader lens, we want to preserve the incentive for institutions and schools and individual households and businesses for various reasons, businesses perhaps for branding purposes, to drive for clean energy, even at a faster pace than maybe would be required under some type of regulation or under the cap. And in California is one way to approach this. When they launched their cap and trade program, they don't call it cap and invest, but it comes down to, it's a similar approach. They created what was called a voluntary renewable energy set aside. So they put aside a tranche of allowances. I think it was 250,000 allowances. And then when the utilities could show that there had been voluntary renewable purchases in excess of the renewable portfolio standard, that they would deduct allowances from that fund, so that there was actually real emission reductions that were achieved, and it wasn't just freeing up allowances that could be used by some other entity in the state. And I think this is really important because it strikes me deeply because of conversations I had with my kids when they were younger, and kids go down to the basement and you tell them to turn the light off, and then you realize, well, if there was just an emissions cap, it doesn't matter whether I leave the light on or not. And for those who are from upper middle income families or whatever, the impact of the carbon price is going to be de minimis compared to the impact of the effects of climate change and the impacts on some other families. So we really need to preserve that incentive at every strata in society to try to achieve our emissions goals, and in so doing, not just lower the price of emission allowances, but ratchet faster emissions reductions. So I think that's what you're getting at, Brian, but maybe you want to follow up with an additional clarification.
No, I think that's right. I mean, that set aside is one of the mechanisms I had in mind. I mean, that's something that's done within some of the RGGI states as well. Not all, but some of them do. In order to enable voluntary buyers to claim those emissions reductions. I was sort of curious if there were any other approaches, because I think ideally we don't want to set up a situation where you have, corporate buyers who are, very aggressive in their clean energy purchases, feeling like they're misaligned with a cap and invest type approach, which would cap emissions in the sector that their sort of that their purchases are within. So, it's just something I think that perhaps it just needs more, efforts and advocacy around awareness that these things can be brought into harmony. But it is something that I think does cause some consternation in that buyer community.
Yeah, indeed. Nationally, over about the last 14 years, roughly 30% of the clean energy investments have been supported with renewable energy credits that were not compliance credits. In other words, they weren't from a state's renewable portfolio standard. They were associated with voluntary clean energy purchases from Google or Apple or smaller or individual households that would get aggregated through some utility function. So I think it's really important to preserve that incentive, and I think it's a little bit of a scalpel you got to take in designing the regulation to make sure that incentive is preserved. I think it's a great question.
Thank you.
We have about 9 minutes left for the discussion section, including the members, and then at about 2:50 we'll open it up to public comment. I have 4 people on the list so far for public comment. Feel free, if you would like to make a public comment, to put your name in the chat. Garrett.
Oh, I was going to ask a very similar question to Brian's question. I think, I guess in the interest of time, Mark, just thinking about how we move forward from this conversation, I think I have that same kind of question about the mechanics of how costs could be downstreamed and to whom, really, around all of these different approaches. These presentations were really interesting. They're all aimed at slightly different amounts of revenue. They're going to affect who pays in slightly different ways. They're going to affect where the investment money goes in different ways. Different stakeholders are going to have different perspective on the kind of the pros and cons of complexity, and which ones might there be serious litigation issues and other stuff that I think it would be very helpful for me, and I probably assume for others, if there were any staff capacity to create any kind of comparative summary of these things to facilitate some of the conversation we might have as a group next. Like I would really love to hear more of the thoughts. A couple people put questions in the chat, asking folks from the chamber, hey, it sounds like you're pointing out potential problems with all of these. I thought Tom Ballantyne gave us a really good list of things we need to think about as we move forward, and we got to move forward with something. Let's answer the question, like, which of these is least problematic? And it seemed like really a couple of them might not be mutually exclusive as well. So would just love to see any more analysis, but especially would love to know, as a member, knowing that you're going to be asking us to provide, to vote probably at some future meeting here on which of these, or more than one, do we recommend. I'd like to get a better sense of how much of that research I need to be doing myself versus what kind of further analysis might be served up to all of us. So that's just something to maybe come back to in the future. Thanks to everybody.
Yeah, and the steering committee hasn't yet grappled with the logistics of how to attempt to bring this forward as a recommendation. So that's Kim and Mike, that's on our list for the next steering committee meeting. Going to Jennifer next.
I thought all the presentations were outstanding, so thank you very much. I really want to ask some questions of the chamber, which I really appreciated their part of the presentation today. So I wanted to note that you pointed out the very real issue of legal issues around Renew. My assumption is that Renew would face a legal challenge. I do think in the end that we win it, but what it means is that it doesn't deliver the cash up front that we need for the urgent things that we need to get done. So in my view, we should do both that and other things, and for which we heard 3 other things that we could do in combination with it. But you were really focused at the chamber on cost, the cost to consumer, the cost to business, the cost to economic growth. And so I'm wondering if by repealing STRIDE, which is now costing us $700 million a year for gas pipelines we don't want or need, if we couldn't create a zero-sum game in terms of the money, because $700 million a year being spent on pipelines we don't want could be better spent on things that we do want to help reduce greenhouse gases. So I'm wondering if the chamber could comment on those issues.
Sure, I appreciate the question. I mean, the chamber does not have a policy on STRIDE. I can give you my company's perspective on it, but let me go back to the kind of bigger question. Ultimately, from a tax policy standpoint, the chamber, as you mentioned, wants the state to be more competitive, wants to lower business costs. The idea of trying to raise $1 billion a year is a significant public policy question and a significant cost to both businesses and residents in Maryland. I will take that question back to the chamber and its policy committees to see if there is some type of idea, suggestion that they have, and we can, certainly come back to the mitigation working group with that recommendation. As far as STRIDE, Columbia Gas of Maryland's position is that this is a very important program for safety and for environmental greenhouse gas reductions. Through STRIDE, we have been able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have been able to ensure the safety and reliability of the gas system in Maryland. That safety and reliability aspect will continue depending on what policy outcome. Certainly we know that there are folks that favor eliminating the gas system, but it's not like we can just flip a switch and turn it off tomorrow, that there won't be use of natural gas in Maryland. So STRIDE needs to continue in order to not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but to remain and have a safe and reliable system.
Thank you. Kim.
Yes, so thanks to everybody. It's been a really great, productive conversation. A lot of hard work ahead. And I want to follow up, I guess, on what Garrett and Jennifer were talking about and direct, Scott, if you can add a part B to the question that you're going to take back to the chamber. And that is that costs are critical, right? Cost to the business community, cost to labor, but there's also cost to communities, the cost to the counties, the cities, and human health costs. And so how does the chamber look at balancing the importance of addressing all those costs? How do we get at all the costs and move the agenda forward? I have to believe that, that nobody's saying, oh, we only look at cost to business. That's the only cost we care about. So how do we get to the other side? So that's a question I have for you all. And I too would echo really open to any ideas you guys have on how to address revenue. So thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, Mark. One other question. Jamie, on the Vermont implementation of the Renew Act, my understanding is, as you said, it got through with supermajority and will not be vetoed and all that. Do you know the status of a legal challenge in Vermont? Has anything happened on that, or do you know where the status is?
No legal challenges have yet been brought. Doesn't mean they won't be, but as of now, it's in the clear.
In the last minute we have before we open it up for public comment, any final question or comment from an MWG or a Climate Commission member? So our pledge is to map out obviously the next steps of this conversation. It's a gnarly one, no doubt about that, but we do intend to revisit this in the July and August meetings to hopefully come closer to some semblance of a recommendation if we're able to land that plane this year. All right, well, turning to public comment, I have in this order, Ellen Valentino, Jeff Silva, Dave Arndt, and Thaddeus Waterman. So I'll turn it first to Ellen, and if each public commenter could try to limit comments to 2 minutes, that'd be great.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm Ellen Valentino, representing the Mid-Atlantic Petroleum Distributors. You know, it's important to have a diverse energy portfolio in Maryland, one that is available and affordable. Moving policies that solely rely on electricity is short-sighted and doesn't take into consideration Maryland's economy, agriculture, or geographic diversity. Any infrastructure is subject to failure. Maryland knows that better than almost any state now, and the electrical grid and delivery of electricity is not immune. Corrections facilities, hospitals, schools, colleges rely on fossil fuels for emergency and increased housing.
Ellen, if you can hear me, you're breaking up a little bit. So
strong enough. Good wins ahead for Maryland, and we think it's important there be real measurement as you guys decide to increase.
okay, thank you. You broke up a little bit, but I think that we caught at least 80% of what you were saying there. Next on the list is Jeff Silva. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. I know, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. I'm going to stay off camera to make sure my comments don't get lost in the transmission. First, thank you to all the dedicated people that researched and composed these economic-oriented carbon capping proposals. The public tacitly is relieved because of your initiative. Second, the Maryland Chamber of Commerce only criticizes the cap and invest proposal without offering any alternative to their business as usual operation that privatizes the profits and injects their climate pollution into our and all of our children's futures. To prove my point, where is their plan that reduces climate pollution? Maryland needs to use proven energy sources that are the lowest cost without artificial insurance liability limits or operational subsidies that government is blackmailed into providing to single source energy producers. Third, apply a discount rate to the banked allowances, these carbon allowances that are banked, so that the compliance value, as described in the tons per allowance, decreases by a certain percentage each year to reduce the incentive to bank those allowances. Fourth, this is more of a retail. Immediately place 100% tax on all two-stroke oil that is sold by retail. Two-stroke engines are not sold with catalytic converters. None of a two-stroke's carbon monoxides, hydrogen oxides, or its unburned gasoline, which turns into photochemical smog, is converted into carbon dioxide as a regular automobile engine is. You could do great wonders by placing a tax on the two-stroke oil that is mixed in the gasoline and then burned through and creating all these toxins. Thank you again for your efforts.
Thank you, Jeff. Going to Dave Arndt.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Okay, and I'm going to stay off camera too for to prevent the streaming problems. Getting first to the Dana Stein's bill on coal exports. just to answer some of the questions, Baltimore does have a significant advantage in exporting coal versus Norfolk. During the bridge collapse and its cleanup, the piles in Baltimore just grew. Because in the end, the companies really know that it's far cheaper to ship out of Baltimore than to be shipping out of Norfolk. So the increase in taxes would not really counteract our shipping advantage there. But however, in the end, we need to actually stop exporting coal because we're exporting climate change and exporting pollution. So that could be another goal that we're looking for. This coal export doesn't really get onto our books as a greenhouse gas, but is something that's being burned all over the world. And we need to look at our total contribution to the world's greenhouse gas emissions. On another question, earlier in the broadcast, we talked about the executive order, and I want to make sure that during the executive order that all the agencies are looking at the data center growth issue as far as greenhouse gas emissions, and is there ways that we can make sure that that is being fully, we're fully looking at that issue? Because the couple data centers that are being proposed right now in Maryland would use 130% of all electricity used as the current all households in Maryland. So we have to really look at this fact that our electric use is going to go up dramatically, and that is being really supplied by the PJM, which is a bulk dirty energy coming into the state, and we got to look at how we compensate for that also. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And the final public comment goes to Thaddeus. Thaddeus, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to start off by saying thank you. I appreciate this opportunity to provide some public discourse, and I'm really grateful for hearing 4 solutions being discussed today. I do just want to start off by saying I am representing myself and my opinions as a Maryland resident and as a concerned citizen. I just want to preface this because I think some of the voices we're hearing today are representing the voice of the people that are benefiting from the status quo. So I think taking no action is not an option. And I think choosing to do so, it would really benefit the people that are right now causing harm and are basically outsourcing their problems to other people. I'm glad they're here today to voice that, but I just want to say that that's something to take with a grain of salt. I think I really just want to say I'm in support of what Jamie said and comment that there were really 4 good solutions presented today to talk about filling the budget deficit. And I think selecting more than one is an option. And so no matter what the decision is put forth, I think there's an opportunity to have a plethora of solutions. But there are 2 that I wanted to kind of emphasize because they not only provide an opportunity to provide the budget emphasis, but also to reduce emissions further, which would be cap and invest and carbon pricing. I think these 2 really provide an opportunity not to just fill the budget solution, but also to help reduce emissions further, which is needed. And I will say, as Dallas mentioned, you really can incorporate a lot of different aspects to both of them. I know a lot of states are going the cap invest route. I would just like to put forward that, and personally, I think carbon pricing is the more advantageous route, and just because of simplicity. Cap invest can do a lot of things with carbon pricing, but it just takes more dialing, more public input, more of that overhead administrative cost that I think just relies on having enforcement mechanisms and other aspects that carbon price doesn't necessarily have to rely on. And so just for simplicity purposes, I think it would be in my preference to emphasize a carbon price, whether it's a CCEJ or another carbon price. I think there's a lot of opportunities there, and it would really make us a leader in the nation and not just following what other states are doing. Yeah, and I'll succeed, and just thanks for your time.
Thanks, Thaddeus, and thanks for joining us today. Kim, Mike, any final comments before we wrap?
No, I think it was a very good conversation. I want to thank everybody who participated, our presenters, as well as those who had public comment questions or those who just watched and listened. It is some very hard decisions and conversations we're going to have.
And we will be having them. So I just want to reassure everybody that this is the priority for this work group for the next couple months. So we'll be diving into this more so and needing more input and thoughts, but we're moving ahead and kind of excited to see what's out there. So thanks to everybody.
Well, go enjoy the longest day of the year, everyone. And do take care. It is a hot one. All right, that's a wrap. We'll see you in July.